Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, and I'm here to support you in overcoming disordered eating and finding peace with food. So if you've been listening for the last few episodes, you realize that the podcast is going a little bit more informal, taking a little bit of a breather from guest interviews for a little while. So if you are really missing the guest interviews, please do go back and listen to the back catalogue. We have about 350 episodes in total, and so many of those are guest episodes. So if you're really wanting the richness and variety and information of the wonderful guests, please go back and have a listen. So for the next few weeks, I'm going to be doing some solo episodes, just feeling like a bit of a change, to share a bit more personal stuff and to just shake things up a bit, really. Sometimes we just need a change. And as the podcast has been going now for 4 years, I can't believe it. Thank you everyone who's listened from the beginning. I massively appreciate you. Just felt a little change of direction. So also now with the podcast, it's also going up on Substack as well. So if you would like a written kind of article of the podcast episode, it will be a slightly shortened one from my rabbiting on here, but you can actually access that on Substack and the link is in the show notes. Okay, so let's dive in today. Today we're going to talk about making sense of your eating disorder through psychological formulation. So if you're lost in the jungle of your eating disorder, without a map to guide you safely, you probably feel intense confusion and overwhelm. Things like, why can't I just eat normally? Why the constant obsessions with food? What is wrong with me? So you probably feel really, really alone. So to begin to unravel the tangled eating disorder vines that have wrapped themselves tortuously around you, and to shed some awareness and understanding of the complexity of the issue, therapists sometimes use the tool of psychological formulation. And psychological formulation aims to piece together the different parts of the jigsaw to bring light and clarity. So it provides a zoom out perspective of the eating disorder as a coping strategy. So it's really looking at it from a much more psychological perspective, whereas you may just feel, oh my goodness, it's all about food. Why can't I just eat normally? So it's really peeling back the different layers of the psychological onion, if there is such a thing, offering insights and hope around change. So firstly, it could explore predisposing factors. So what we mean here is the early childhood influences and maybe your genetics that may have led you to this point. And I think it is quite a complex mix of nature and nurture. Secondly, it can help you identify your core beliefs. Now, your core beliefs are kind of how you feel about yourself deep down. You know, if we sort of strip back all the layers, really, like how you're really feeling about yourself in your core. We'll talk more about this in a minute. And you can identify specific triggers which might have influenced the eating disorder in the beginning. Because I think often as well, something that triggers it isn't necessarily the cause. It's almost like the trigger is the thing that kind of sets it off. But often the seeds were sown, I believe, often much earlier. And thirdly, the perpetuating factors. So what I mean here is the behaviours, thoughts and feelings that tend to keep you trapped in unhelpful cycles. Again, I'm going to talk in more detail about this. So between therapist and client, by co-creating the formulation collaboratively, this can create a shared understanding of the therapy focus and also offer suggested areas for change. So it provides a guide to default to for the therapy progression, and it can be changed and adapted at any point. So I think what's really important is, as a client, you need to feel that you own your formulation. You don't want to feel that your therapist has put you in a box and labelled you in a certain way. It's really important that the language used is your language and is meaningful to you and really adequately explains the different experiences that you have been through. You know, you need to feel a sense of ownership. You don't want to feel that you've just been stuck in a psychological box. And I think that could be the criticism of psychological formulation, that sometimes we're not specific or individual enough for each person. So I think that's really, really important. And I guess as many roads lead to Rome, this is not an essential or only way to approach eating disorder therapy. It is simply a tool. And I'm no purist, I'm an integrative therapist. So I use a range of therapies specifically helpful in treating eating disorders by combining work on the deeper issues with symptom interruption. So the approach I'm going to be talking about today is mostly based around cognitive behaviour therapy, but the themes in cognitive behaviour therapy are relatable and applicable in all types of therapy, okay? Usually, therapies are really quite similar when we boil down to the basic bones of what's underneath. There's just a slightly different way of explaining it. So the language and explanation of how you approach psychological formulation will depend a bit on the modality. Okay, so let's dive in. So first of all, the predisposing factors. So these are the things from your past and your genetics. So eating disorders are complex illnesses. There is no singular cause, and this can make treatment difficult. An experience from my 20 years inside the therapy room indicates that most people have lived through some kind of psychological trauma or traumas which has contributed to the eating disorder development. So it can be the big T traumas, things like abuse or neglect, but I think much more commonly it's the small t traumas which are impactful and pervasive through the incremental drip accumulation of time. Now, it's such a common thing that people come into therapy and say, I don't understand why I'm struggling. I had a really loving childhood and my parents really met my needs. I just don't really understand. And I think this is where the small t traumas are much more subtle, because I think often we have been raised by loving and kind parents, but who had little understanding of mental health because they grew up in a time when mental health just was not given time and attention in the way that it should have been. So parents are just doing the absolute best they can at the time and not really recognizing sometimes how it can be helpful to show up in a very emotionally present way and being able to kind of validate a child's feelings and all those good things. So I think it's very common in a way that you may feel like, I don't really understand, why have I got these issues with my mental health? Often the traumas can be more subtle, but actually still very impactful. And they can include things like perhaps a little criticism, or maybe it could be at school where you're experiencing chronic bullying. It could be that maybe one of your parents struggled with their mental health, so they weren't able to be present with you. Maybe they were just really, really busy looking after relatives or working really hard, just trying to keep everyone afloat. Could be multiple things going on. Or it could be even things like from your childhood where you lost a pet, or you're going through a really difficult time at school. There can be multiple things that can all contribute to these small t traumas. And I think what's so important is fundamentally, if you feel that something has impacted you in a traumatic way, this is your truth. It doesn't matter if others appear to have it worse or if the trauma feels minimal, your emotional response is a valid one. I think that's really, really important because I think often we kind of gaslight ourselves and, just won't give ourselves that understanding that these things have been difficult to deal with. So what about the interplay of genetics and environment in eating disorder development? So although I'm not madly keen on the phrase, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger, this does resonate with many of my client observations. And research is helping us understand the correlations and links between neurobiology and eating disorders. And it is considered that approximately half the risk of developing an eating disorder can be genetically influenced. And certainly some individuals with a genetic predisposition towards sensitivity can be impacted more severely by adverse environmental triggers compared to maybe a more robust child who is naturally born with a thicker skin. And Dr. Thomas Boyce describes these types of children in his fascinating research as orchids, the sensitive, and dandelions, the robust. And people with eating disorders are often sensitive, empathic souls who experience life deeply, more often the orchids. And any exposure to trauma or detrimental environmental messages around food and body could potentially impact orchids more than their dandelion counterparts. So orchids can also be more vulnerable to experiencing low self-worth and internalizing these messages deeply. Now I know in my own family with 4 sisters, we all suffered from eating disorders. But interestingly, I would say we're all sensitive beings, but I would say that my second sister is probably like highly sensitive, and she doesn't have a diagnosis, but she may also be neurodivergent, possibly has autism. And She is the one of the four of us that actually developed anorexia nervosa. Now, I always think that anorexia nervosa is the kind of like the harshest of the eating disorders, not to minimize anyone else's experience. I think all the eating disorders are pretty grim, but usually people that develop anorexia nervosa tend to have that higher sensitivity and to really absorb things from their environment in a very sort of like sponge like way, I guess. So they can be really, really impacted. So that's just quite interesting because I think so interesting in my own family, four sisters, four different eating disorders, similar environment, obviously slightly different mix of genetics. Very, very interesting how things pan out. So something else that can be highly impactful is if you have low self-esteem. Low self-esteem renders you extremely susceptible to eating disorders in a thin, idealizing culture. And I guess, again, sometimes it's hard with low self-worth, I think, isn't it, to untangle how much of that is genetics and environment. But I think it's quite a complex interplay of the two. But in our culture, even if behind closed doors you're cold, miserable, obsessed with food 24/7, you'll be praised and validated for your strict diet and changing body shape. So in an uncontrollable and uncertain world, which is the one which we are living in, where you're not feeling good enough, a focus on food and body can be an appealing option towards glimmers of self-worth, like it's a coping strategy. And if you are neurodivergent as well, you may have increased vulnerability to developing an eating disorder for all kinds of reasons. And I think it's extremely stressful to navigate living in a neurotypical world when you are neurodivergent. So I guess firstly, explore your own predisposing factors. What feels relevant to you from your past experiences? What factors have contributed to your relationship with food? What factors have contributed to your relationship with yourself? And how can you offer compassion and understanding to your younger self? And again, if you want to look at the article on this on Substack, you can go to the link in my bio, and then I kind of got the formulation drawn out. So sometimes it's easier to have a visual to kind of prompt you to kind of really think through the formulation. Okay, so we're moving on now to core beliefs. So most of the predisposing factors, those things that happened in your younger years, I would say are embedded and imprinted into your psyche from pre-10 years old. It's a largely unconscious process, but it happens really early in life. And these are the most vulnerable years when you absorb the influences like a thirsty sponge, soaking up every drop, and this shaping your identity and worldview. And many of my clients will often remember a distinct feeling of unworthiness or not good enough from the tender age of 3 or 4. So things like, I just remember feeling ugly and big compared to my sister. I felt like I was the bad child. I felt there was something wrong with me. I felt that people didn't like me. And lying underneath these derogatory statements is a fundamental belief of I'm not good enough. And this is what can be described as a core belief. And core beliefs, they're often like unconscious core sort of sensing, really. So you may or may not have the awareness of these deeper beliefs, but your life, if you look at your life, it will be reflecting back to you your feelings of worthiness or unworthiness. So, for example, if a lot of your relationships are where you're giving too much or others don't respect you, if in your work or study, you push yourself to burnout or you don't put yourself forward for promotion, you sort of stay quiet. If you don't look after yourself well, perhaps you don't sleep, you restrict your eating, you drink alcohol. These are just examples, I guess, but the core beliefs will impact the tiny details of the fabric of your life, albeit unconsciously. So, and I guess the opposite of true is true as well. Like if you're genuinely feeling I am good enough, you will treat yourself well. You will be surrounding yourself with people that bring nourishment and love into your life. You will be getting good sleep. You'll be feeding yourself regularly. You won't be kind of sabotaging yourself with alcohol. Okay. So I think the important thing is here, it's not about shaming anyone, because if you feel that your life is reflecting back feelings of unworthiness, this is often unconscious. You're not choosing to do this. It's almost just kind of being reenacted out from your childhood familiar experiences and things that have happened to you. But again, it's just really helpful to start to notice what your core beliefs might be and to think about this a bit more. So to understand your core beliefs, recognize some of the negative thoughts that you have in the present, firstly. So these may be things like, I'm not in control of my eating. My body is too big. So for each thought, ask yourself the question, what does this mean to me? So say, for example, if you're staying in the present, my body is too big, and then you think, what does this mean to me? It might be like, I failed or something. And then you could say to yourself again, and what does this mean to me? And then it might, get to a point of just thinking, I am not good enough, or a variation on this. So you can really start to kind of get to your core beliefs by asking this question, what does this thought I'm having in the present mean to me? Then the trigger event for an eating disorder. So the predisposing seeds are sown deeply in the ground of your younger years, and they may lay dormant, largely hidden, as you go about your life with head above water, but with lurking feelings of low self-esteem and unworthiness. So these predisposing factors may well be food and body related, but also connected to your emotional needs, whether met or unmet. Then what tends to happen is an eating disorder often begins when a trigger event tips you over the coping edge. So the trigger itself is the tipping point often, rather than the fundamental cause. Now, I think as well that this is why so many people developed eating disorders in the pandemic, because of, I guess there's many people out there in the world, many of us that, perhaps have struggled with our mental health, where we're kind of like almost clinging on to the cliff edge by our fingernails almost, just about coping, just about managing. And then you have a big stressor like the pandemic where you're suddenly isolated, working from home, there's so much anxiety, you can't connect with people. And then that for many, many people was a trigger for their eating disorder, because they possibly already had disordered eating, low self-esteem, and it was almost like the pandemic was like this kind of rocket fuel which just kind of sent, everyone off into a very, very difficult place. And I think that's one of the reasons we had such an explosion. But triggers can be varied. It could be like a transition. So many people develop an eating disorder perhaps when they move to university or they go to a new school, or it could be, if you are further on in your life when you suddenly experience empty nest syndrome. It could be the pandemic. It could be a relationship breaking down. It could be a bereavement or a loss. It could be going on a very strict diet. It could be a bodybuilding competition or something in fitness that pushes you to an extreme, or something else. And I guess often what happens with the trigger thing is you begin to control food and lose weight to feel better. So the trigger event has made you feel not very good about yourself. You think, right, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to control my food, I'm going to feel better. And initially as well, you do feel a bit better. Emotions are numbed, you're distracted, you feel a sense of control and purpose. And of course, in effed up diet culture, people will probably start praising and validating you. And you'll think, yes, I've really found the thing that makes my life work. But of course, the initial honeymoon phase of accomplishment and goodness is often short-lived. You quickly tip into obsessing about food and developing disordered eating behaviours. And then the eating disorder has become a way, consciously or unconsciously, to cope. And it's very challenging then to detach from it. Okay, so have a think about what has been a trigger event for you around your eating disorder. Can you identify something that maybe tipped you over the edge? And can you recognize that maybe before that trigger event happened, that you were already like hanging on to the edge of the cliff a bit precariously? Okay, and now I'm going to talk about perpetuating factors. These are the things that keep an eating disorder going. So once in the extensive rabbit warren of an eating disorder, with head firmly focused down on restriction, food and body, it is near impossible to see the wood for the trees. And the deeper you descend into the warren, the harder it is to have perspective and to adopt a zoom out lens. The over-evaluation of self-worth in relation to body size drives behaviours that add fuel to a burning furnace. So things like weighing yourself, body checking in the mirror, social media scrolling and scrutinising your body numerous times per day. All of these things add fuel to that burning fire. And of course, when you're focusing so intensely on your body, you're going to feel dissatisfied. It's going to lead to dietary restraint. So you start cutting out food groups, you delay your eating, you restrict your intake. And before long, of course, you're preoccupied with food, you're starving, hungry, and then you understandably slip into out of control eating episodes, binge eating, maybe chewing and spitting, or emotional eating. And then this places you at high risk of sliding into compensatory strategies such as vomiting, laxatives, or over-exercise. And the cycle spins you tightly, and your reality becomes intensely focused on food and body. But interrupting some of these perpetuating cycles can be critical in the process of change. And this was so true for me in my recovery. I was massively focused on my body. I was weighing myself all the time, multiple times per day, really down that rabbit hole. I was then being very restrictive. I was not eating enough carbs. I was not eating enough calories. I would constantly be getting over hungry. I'd fall into binge eating. And then I sort of felt that I was addicted to food. You know, my blood sugar would get so low that once I started eating, I would get such a euphoric high from eating. Endorphins, blood sugar rush, all of the things. And then, of course, I would overeat to a point I felt uncomfortably full. And I would then slide into kind of really unhelpful, destructive behaviors such as purging, etc. And it was an awful, awful cycle. Because I'd feel so much shame and embarrassment and humiliation from being in that cycle. And of course, what would I do to try and rectify it? Restrict some more. So think about your own perpetuating factors. What is keeping your eating disorder going? So a bit of an overview. Psychological formulation is a tool to provide an overview and understanding between client and therapist. And as an integrative therapist, I believe in supporting clients with symptom interruption alongside working on the deeper issues. Because focusing only on the childhood issues may leave you trapped in perpetuating cycles which fuel the eating disorder behaviours, and focusing only on the symptoms can lead to behavioural change but a risk of transferring the coping to something else, alcohol, shopping, overwork as examples. So my personal view is that an integrative approach to treating eating disorders can be valuable, but it's not the only approach. Formulation is one tool, and my example here is one of many types that could be used. So some reflective questions for you to have a think about. What do you think of psychological formulation as a tool? Have you experienced this as a client? And would you use this as a therapist? You know, I'd love to hear. You can also get in touch with me, like either in the comments below, or you can contact me on Instagram at the eating disorder therapist _, or you can email me harriet.frew@gmail.com. Now, if you enjoy the podcast and you're enjoying Substack and you want additional opportunities to engage with my content where you can actually ask questions that I will personally respond to and you can remain anonymous, you may want to join my paid Substack, which is simply £5 a month. And then every Friday you get a little podcast audio into your inbox where you can ask specific questions and I will respond to these. So it gets very, very personal. And I also share more about my own recovery and different kind of things I'm working on as an ongoing issue. So yeah, anyway, hope to see some of you over there. If you want to go to my Substack, the link is in the show notes. And of course, you don't have to be a paid subscriber. You can be a free subscriber. Just go to the link in my show notes. And again, you can sign up for free and you will get 2 articles a week every Wednesday and Saturday. And then the paid extra audio is on Friday. So if you're enjoying the content, you know, that's where to go. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you all being here. If you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the eating disorder therapist _. For further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. And if you enjoy this podcast, I would be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.